Hi, everybody, and welcome to our latest edition of Shy Hack Night Remote. Tonight, we are on Shy Hack Night number I actually don't know because it's not on the title slide of the presentation, but it's a large number, I assure you. I can probably look it up real quickly.
I'm guessing, let's say three, four, no.
No, we've hit 4. It's 414 tonight.
Wow. Okay, really off there.
So we're glad you could join us. My name is Soren Spicknall. I'll be one of your two co-hosts this evening, along with...
My name is Ryan Spencer, and I'll be your other co-host.
So tonight we're excited to be hosting Viktor Köves on the topic of accessibility in web design and development.
And we hope you all decide to stick around after presentation for a live Q&A, and then we're also going to have a civic portion, the civic hacking portion of the evening, and we'll also be doing the Q&A through the YouTube live chat, so feel free to start thinking of your questions now. And then also as a friendly reminder, please remember that we still do have a code of conduct, so although we're virtual, we still have the Shy Hack Night Code of Conduct, which will be strictly enforced, and so we ask that you are respectful and considerate, and when you're posting questions in the chat. Okay. With that being said, I think it's time to do a few announcements. Okay, so if you haven't already done so, please feel free to join the Shy Hack Night Slack remote channel. This is a really great place to stay up to date on anything that's happening in Shy Hack Night, the community, any announcements or changes, and also a great way to just get to know the Shy Hack Night community. So if you're not already familiar, feel free to drop in, introduce yourself, say hi. And it's also a really great place to find resources like jobs, which are always helpful. Ask a question, I'm sure someone's going to give you an answer. And yeah, just talk about, cool things related to civic tech and maybe some questions you want answers to. Okay. And then we do have some exciting upcoming presentations. So next week, I will also be co-hosting, and we will have Adam Anderson from Amulet Health, as well as H2 Now for Chicago Water Week, and then El Ramel with Get Cities. So stay tuned for some exciting upcoming presentations. So if you're not already aware, Shy Hack Night does have a tech and data help desk now. So you can, for instance, if you are an organization, or maybe you're aware of an organization that may need help from the help desk, feel free to follow that form, as well as also sign up to help out. So if you have some skills that you would like to volunteer, they're always looking for additional people to help out. And then if you are running a breakout group, please feel free to fill out this form. We're just kind of doing a quick survey to get some information on the current breakout groups at Shy Hack Night. So if you have not already done so, please let us know the status of your breakout group by filling out the bit.ly form.
All right, so next up on the announcements are some things that aren't directly related to Shy Hack Night. Cook County government this week is hosting a racial equity week with events all throughout the week. I know that some previous Shy Hack Night presenters like Tanika Johnson are involved in events for this week. So check out the schedule there and see if there's anything that interests you.
I can hear a cat in the background.
Yes, my cat is trying to be part of the presentation. Next up, register to vote by mail. If you're in the city or if you're in suburban Cook County, that makes a difference. There are different election authorities for those two different parts of Cook County. So follow whatever link is relevant to you right there. The deadline to register here is October 29th. And then fill out your census. The census is extremely important, and Chicago's overall census response rate and Cook County's overall, well, it looks like the county overall is actually doing about on par for the nation, but Chicago's census response rate has been fairly low so far. So please fill it out yourself, talk to people you know, talk to community organizations you're involved in, and so on and so forth. It's very important to getting us representation in Congress, to getting funding from federal programs, and a lot of other good things. Additionally, getting back to Shy Hack Night related stuff, after the presentation, there will be a Zoom call that'll go over intros, announcements, and breakout group pitches. If you don't know what a breakout group is, it's basically a project or a learning group of people who exist here at Shy Hack Night, and they meet every week and they work on stuff together or they learn about stuff together. The link to that is right there, bit.ly/chn-remote-zoom.
Oh, well, I think that was all the announcements. So. Oh, there's our third co-host.
So during this presentation, we'll have a Q&A that happens in the live chat on YouTube afterward. And then there's also a space for Q&A in, are we doing the doc? Or no? We've got an agenda presentation, so it'll be in the YouTube Q&A, right?
Yeah.
We'll do it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, disembodied Shy Hack Night voice, and also Ryan. If you couldn't tell, this is my first time in a while that I've co-hosted Shy Hack Night. So Q&A through YouTube live after the presentation. And I guess it's time?
Yeah, I think it's time.
All right. Without further ado, his video's on. I'll hand it over to Viktor Köves as he talks about web accessibility.
All right. Well, thank you, Soren. So first of all, hi, everyone in the ambiguous ether of 2020. I'm sure you're out there, whether it's the present or the future. I'm really excited to be giving this talk. So let me share my screen here, make sure everything's going there. Perfect. There we go. Ryan, Soren, does everything look good on your end?
It looks great.
Yep, good to me.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm gonna get started. I'm first of all a little bit nervous, so apologies in advance, but luckily Soren's cat has diffused most of that. I'd just like to give a shout out to Bula there. I appreciate that, Bula. So, hello everyone. I'm going to be talking about how you can ensure accessibility in your Civic Tech project. As Soren mentioned, I'm Viktor Köves. If you're wondering, how do I pronounce that name? That's complicated. If you wanted to pronounce it correctly, you're going to have to learn another language. So Köves is just fine, but also it's the internet. No one will know. So first of all, who am I? Who am I to be giving this talk to all of you this evening? So I'm Viktor, and I work on the web for a living, and I specialize in front-end development and accessibility in particular. And I've also been involved in Shy Hack Night for a while, including helping development in several projects, including one with Soren actually. So I'm no stranger to the Shy Hack Night community and Civic Tech at large. So first of all, I want to set down kind of some ground rules and make it really clear what I will be covering in this presentation and what I won't be. So what I will be talking about is what is accessibility, right? If you have no idea what accessibility is at all, I'll give you kind of a quick crash course. Second, why accessibility matters, especially in the space of civic tech. And then for 3 and 4, some actual actionable tips that you can make your projects accessible with. So kind of the third part will be for designers in particular. So when you're designing your projects from a visual perspective, what can you do to make sure it's going to be accessible? And then also step 4 is for developers. So when you're actually doing your breakout group and you're writing code, how do you make sure that you're creating a project that's going to be accessible? So let's dive right in. But first, what I'm not going to talk about. This is just as important as what I am going to say. So first, I'm not going to get into super in-depth technical discussions on accessibility. So I'm going to be covering kind of like a broad set of tips, but I'm not going to go into like a super granular detail level, mostly for the sake of time, right? There's going to be plenty of time for Q&A, but also I'm available on the Shy Hack Night Slack, and I'll have some contact information in the closing. So you can always reach out to me afterwards. Second, accessibility law. There is some law around accessibility, especially around like the government space, schools, and all of those things. I am not a lawyer, so anything I say does not constitute legal advice, first and foremost. But second, I don't really speak in the law side of things as much, and I'm not as versed to talk about that. And also, that's not really going to be as prominent in this discussion. And third, accessibility standards. There's a wide variety of those. WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are the main one. But again, that is like, there are books written on WCAG. So I'm not going to be covering that simply for the sake of time. So let's start with an overview. What's accessibility? So accessibility is often thought of in terms of making sites, and we're talking about accessibility on the web in this specific case, work for people with disabilities. But we can actually define that a little bit more broadly. And I'll just read from the quote here. Accessibility is the practice of making your websites usable by as many people as possible. You could also think of accessibility as treating everyone the same and giving them the same opportunities no matter what their ability or circumstances. This comes from a lovely overview of accessibility from MDM. So with that context, we have accessibility. We have a kind of a broad sense of letting everyone in, but we also think of accessibility in terms of being specifically inclusive to people with disabilities. So we want to define what a disability is. So disability is not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. And this comes straight from the World Health Organization. And to visualize that a little bit better, so this lovely diagram from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit that essentially says disability is not a personal health condition, it's a mismatch of human interactions. And so kind of a way to think about this is that a person that we might describe as having a disability won't experience that disability really if there isn't some kind of hindrance with the environment, right? If your website is doing everything as intended, your users shouldn't be aware of their disability just by using your website, right? If that's the case, something's gone wrong. Similarly, in the situation that like if you're using a wheelchair and there aren't, elevators, there aren't ramps, there aren't kind of the accessible infrastructure in place, it's that mismatch that really creates that disability. So in visualizing disability, it's helpful to look kind of at the grand scheme of things, and Microsoft's persona spectrum is particularly useful for this, to visualize some of these mismatches between a person's body and environment. And what's also useful here is that you can see in the top that it groups it into 3 columns: permanent, temporary, and situational. So permanent disability is something that someone carries with them often throughout a lifetime or after some kind of event. So for instance, having one arm, being blind, deaf, or nonverbal. But the kind of disability that is, that category of touch, see, hear, and speak laid out here, can also happen temporarily. So for instance, I don't have one arm, but I have had my arm broken. And at that point, I didn't have use of that arm. So at that time, I had a temporary touch kind of like, or motor impairment, the arm injury. In the same sense, you can also think of a situational impairment where that function isn't kind of like removed, but you might not be able to get that full use out of it due to some circumstance. So in this case, you can see the example of a new parent of if you're constantly holding a baby, then even though you have that arm to take advantage of, if you're using like a phone, you actually need the ability to work completely with one hand. And the same way, if we're looking at hearing, you can think of a bartender, or even yourself as a patron in a crowded bar. I know, 2019 was wild, crowded bars. But point is, if you think of closed captions, those are typically the original target was the deaf community. But if you're someone who has a temporary hearing impairment from an ear infection that's shown here, or if you're in a situation where you can't hear, like in a bar, those closed captions still benefit you. And this is kind of an effect that's often coined and called the the curb cut effect. There we go. Because curb cuts, which are those kind of like ramps that you see that bring the curb down to street level, are intended for wheelchair users to make sure that they can smoothly traverse sidewalks and have a seamless experience. But they also have side effects of benefiting people with strollers, people using carts, and a wide variety of other users. So this curb cut effect means that even when you're targeting users with disabilities, there's going to be a variety of knock-on effects that help out other users. So why does accessibility matter? At this point, I hope it's blatantly obvious. When we make any product, we want to ensure that all possible users can use it equally. And if we don't make our tools accessible, we're going to be continuing to lock out people with disabilities who have been often left out of the conversation and circles of power for centuries, right? Especially if you're talking about tools that help people engage with their government or get more information, it's really critical that you include everybody. And accessibility is a really big part of that. And there's also, if you're at a company or something like that, there's a variety of other reasons that you can stack on top of this. But I like to stick to this fundamental moral foundation of accessibility is our duty as people who make products. So a quick explanation of WCAG. I know, I said I wouldn't cover it, but it's something that is going to be referenced so often in the world of accessibility, I want to give just one slide on it. So WCAG, as I mentioned briefly before, is short for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And it's a set of standards commonly used to assess accessibility. Government websites and sites funded by the federal government, we're getting into law here, another thing I said I wouldn't cover, are typically required to be compliant at the AA level. And so WCAG has these 3 levels, A being the least stringent, where it's just like the very bare bones, AA being kind of a medium level, that is what's commonly required for compliance, and AAA being a very strict level that is going above and beyond for accessibility, typically with higher level thresholds for color contrast and enhanced things around things like reading level. And of course, I linked to the W3's WCAG homepage. W3 is the web consortium who made WCAG. So if you want to learn more, I'll send out the slides afterwards and you can dig more into it. But it's just worth having like a quick, if people mention WCAG, this is what you need to know. So now that we have a brief overview of accessibility and kind of those basics, let's actually dive into our technical tips. So for you designers out there, or for anyone who's kind of doing the visual or planning of a product, let's talk to you. So first things first is color contrast. This is one of the most common accessibility issues in designs. And you have to make sure that your text has sufficient contrast from its background using a tool like contrastratio.com. If you're a developer, there's also a lot of tools built into your browser, like Chrome has them built in. But a nice tool like this will let you just put in 2 color values and make sure they're contrast compliant. Now, to illustrate this, I have this visual example here, and this is actually why I mentioned WCAG, is I have to tie it to the guidelines in this specific case. So you can see the text is up above, and you can see test text all the way to the left here is in this very faint gray. And that is not compliant either the WCAG AA or AAA levels. And now as we get to this darker text, this is AA compliant, right? So to most levels of legal requirement for governments and universities, this is compliant text, but it's not WCAG AAA compliant. So if you're really targeting, like making sure your site is super usable, is really, really great for accessibility, you want to target that AAA compliance. And this even darker shade of text is compliant there. And so these are just kind of like specific examples. The WCAG guidelines set out specific numeric thresholds that a tool like contrastratio.com will point out to you, and will say like, okay, at this to this, the ratio is like this number, and I believe it's 4.5 for AA is the requirement under certain sizes, and the numbers get a little complicated. So I didn't cite those specifically here because they won't mean anything outside of like a tool like contrast ratio. But essentially, check your contrast. So anytime you have text, you want to say like, is this readable? And check it using a tool like this to make sure that it is. And you also notice all the way over on the right, I actually have an example with icons. So the latest version of WCAG, WCAG 2.1, specifically mentions icons because previously in the web, icons may have just been decorative, but nowadays they're often used very functionally. And so it's important that your users who may have lower vision can really see those clearly. So in this case, if I have this help icon with this little life raft, when it's this kind of like salmony pink, it's not contrast compliant. The difference between the white background and that pink isn't high enough to be clear to all users. So this kind of bolder red, that is contrast compliant, and that will work for a wide variety of users. So moving on, another thing related to color is ensuring colorless meaning. Now this is a common issue that I see with designs. You have to remember, not all of our users see colors the same way or even see color at all. And color should always be a supplement and not the only way that information is conveyed. So to give a really visceral example of this kind of 4-piece diagram, this left column, you have the don't, and you see that it says email address, and then there's this red email error at the bottom. And then the second line, this kind of like second example below it, is what it would look like to someone who has monochromacy or essentially sees in grayscale. And this is just rough, but it's to show this concept that if I'm just looking at this, I don't have that additional color information. If I don't know that text is red, I don't actually know that this field is errored. Now for comparison, in the do column, what I did here is I said, okay, clear language, email is required, making it clear that there's an error. And I also added an icon that independent of the color will be clear that, okay, there's a warning here, something's going on. So if we convert that to grayscale, you can see that's really clear, like, okay, there's some darker text, email is required. So even if I don't see that that text is red, it's clear to me what's going on. And you may be thinking, Victor, this is a little on the nose. Like, would this ever happen in the real world? And the answer is actually yes. And there was a specific example with PayPal who had a sign-up page where I think they just bolded the error text or bolded the label of the input and then made the input box have a red border. And if you had it in grayscale, it was completely unclear what fields were errored versus what weren't. So this is something that can happen in the real world if you're trying to be a little bit too minimalistic, right? If you're hiding too many elements and just using color to convey meaning, which is a big no-no. So the next thing is providing content alternatives. Anytime you're making a big site or you're publishing information, you're lots of times going to be dealing with video or audio. But you have to remember that that's not a form of media that works for everyone. So you have to ensure that content is captioned and or you provide an alternative like a transcript. So for example, if you're publishing a YouTube video, you want to make sure that the captions include audio and video, clearly conveying what is going on both for those who may be deaf or who may be blind. And this is especially important for something like an instructional video, right? If you're trying to give an example of, let's say, how to change a car tire, you want to make sure that if someone's blind, they still get the relevant information. And if someone's deaf and doesn't hear narration, that information is communicated to them through the captions. That's really important. And the other thing too is this applies for any form of media. And we'll talk about images later for the developer side, but also consider this for audio. One of the biggest complaints I've seen is people publishing podcasts or other forms of audio with no transcripts or captions. So there's no way for anyone in the deaf community to really engage with your content. And that's especially going to be a big problem if you're trying to reach a wide audience. And next up, don't autoplay animations. I love a good animation. And so this is something that I've seen a lot on the web as people are trying to make something really flashy and really cool. But we have to remember that there are people with photosensitivities. And so large animations can actually trigger seizures for folks that have epilepsy or other photosensitive conditions. So they're best generally avoided. If you do need a large animation or you really want to make one, just don't play them by default and instead provide controls for your users who choose to use them. The important thing here is your animations should never be a requirement for using your platform or product. Right? If your homepage just animates in right away, you might have triggered someone's epileptic seizure, and that's going to be a big problem. And that's actually an issue I saw with a redesign of a site recently. There was a lot of backlash to it because it did actually trigger those kind of epileptic responses. So you want to make sure that you're really careful when using large animations. WCAG again provides specific guidance here because there's certain like kind of size and flashing guidance in particular, but even like a medium-sized big flashing animation, big no-no. So if it's a smaller animation though, like if you think of like the Twitter like animation that's pretty small in size and isn't a big flash, those are usually okay because the size of the viewing area is much smaller. So now that we've covered some accessibility tips for designers, let's dig in for our developers out there. So first of all, a quick note, all of those things in the past probably apply to you too, especially color contrast. But these are more technical tips that designers out there might not find as helpful. But it's good for you to know too, so you can talk to your developers about it. So first, you have to learn about and add alt text. Alt text, also known as the alt attribute, is text you specify in an image, the img element, to provide its equivalent meaning to screen readers or users not loading images. And alt text is context dependent. So the same image can actually have totally different alt text based on your use. This is something that trips people up because they think, oh, alt text for an image. I just describe what I see in the image. But that's not really the point. Because if you think about it, a screen reader user is going to be hearing your alt text instead of the image. So if the image is decorative, you might not need alt text at all. But if the image is for an art class or something like that, where you really care about the kind of style and the decorative aspects of the image, you want to make sure those are conveyed within your alt text. So this article on alternative text actually is where I grabbed this example from. But this single image of George Washington can have tons of different alt text descriptions depending on the context in which they're displayed. So for example, if I just have a website that's just a gallery of the presidents and just has a bunch of image tiles, then my alt text may well just be George Washington, because the specifics of how the image was drawn or anything like that don't really matter. What you care about is who is the president being displayed. Now, let's say you're on an art website and you are showing this portrait in ginormous glory. You want to make sure that people really get the whole context of it and also potentially a bit of history. Then you might say portrait of George Washington based on Gilbert Stuart's unfinished Athenaeum portrait. And then last but not least, nothing. This is one that can often trip people up. But if it's decorative, you don't want an alt tag, or you want an alt equals empty, an empty alt tag. So a good kind of litmus test for this is if you were reading out the website to someone, right? Someone said, hey, can you read out this page to me just so I get the content, would you insert this image? Would you say something for it? So for example, let's say you have a George Washington fan club website and you just have this image every 2 lines, just side to side all the time. You wouldn't insert that image because it's purely decorative, right? There's some other content and it's just surrounding it as kind of filler. Or for example, if instead of a photo of George Washington, you had some kind of like classic decorative image, say like you have someone waving or some like stock photo that isn't meant to convey some specific message, then that would be an appropriate place to use an empty alt tag. Now, next up is using semantic HTML. This is one of the biggest things you can do as a developer to make sure your website is accessible. And actually, it's really easy to do and often saves you a lot of time. And why is that? Well, HTML has a lot of accessibility tricks built in if you use the right elements. So in particular, these are just a few highlights, but I'd recommend that you dig into more about HTML to learn all of the elements that are available to you. There are a lot. But for example, make sure to use the A tag, the anchor tag, for links, the button tag for buttons, UL or OL for lists, and so on. Knowing all of the HTML elements that are available to you can save you a lot of time and ensure your product is accessible to tools like screen readers by default. And you might be thinking, Victor, of course I use the button. Or maybe you're thinking, well, why? I've seen a website that I won't name specifically that used divs for all of their interactive elements. And although that works because you can bind JavaScript to the click of a div, what happens is if I'm a screen reader or a keyboard user, I actually can't interact with those elements at all because a screen reader isn't expecting a div to be clickable. A button, on the other hand, is known to be clickable. So although you might have to override a few extra styles, you're going to get a lot of default behavior just built in for free. And next up, test with automated tools. Automated tools can test a wide variety of things and find a lot of issues that would be really time-consuming to check manually, like color contrast, missing alt tags, and heading level skips. So in this case, if you run an automated tool, it's actually going to find all of the color contrast failures for you in one go without requiring you individually inspect each element. And one of my favorites is HTML Code Sniffer, which is just a little bookmarklet. But there's also a bunch of other tools out there, including Lighthouse, which is built into Chrome. And last but not least, for developers, you want to manually test. To make your site truly accessible, you need to be manually checking for it. A few methods to do this are using your site with a screen reader, using your site in grayscale, and testing your site using only your keyboard, not your mouse. And the reason for this is that automated tools just don't catch everything. If you're looking at more nuanced things like, is this site clear? Is focus cleanly traveling between places? Or other things like that, even like, is this alt tag context relevant? That's not going to be caught by an automated tool. It's just going to say like, do you have an alt tag, right? Is this color contrast compliant? So really the user experience is fundamentally rooted in the experiences of people with disabilities, and manual testing is going to get a lot closer to that. So wrapping up, accessibility is a mindset, not just a series of guidelines. And that's why I also didn't want to focus on WCAG too much, is because that's kind of a checklist. But accessibility is really about getting disabled people or people with disabilities into your process and making sure that they're included at the design stage, building, testing, and making sure that all these folks can use your application and product. It's not just about, do you meet these checklist of requirements? Because ultimately, you can meet all the WCAG requirements, but still have a site that's not great to use. And so I want to also close with some extra resources. These, when I send out the slide deck, will be all interactive. The web accessibility tutorials from W3 are fantastic and have been a really great foundation for a lot of folks. Accessibility Insights for Web is a Microsoft Chrome extension that lets you do a lot of things, including switching your site to grayscale, view heading levels, and a lot more. That can be really useful. My articles on accessibility, I've done a lot of writing on accessibility. So if you're a developer starting out who's looking to build an accessible form or figure out how to do more testing, I have some articles that should be of interest to you. And then last but not least, this little article, Emulating Vision Deficiencies with Chrome DevTools. Chrome has a built-in tool to emulate any kind of vision deficiency or a variety of them. And that can be really useful. So you can see like, okay, if someone has monochromacy or red-green color blindness, will my site work for them? So that's about it. Now it's time for some questions. But first, if you have any questions that you want to send me privately, or you want help making your ChaiHackNet project or other project accessible, you can feel free to contact me. So there's this email up on the screen, contact@viktorkoves.com, where you can reach out to me, or message me at vkoves, K-O-V-E-S, in the ChaiHackNet Slack. So I'm here, available for your needs. So thank you so much. And Soren and Ryan, it's back to you.
All right. Thanks, Victor.
Yeah, I was frantically taking notes.
So we can go ahead and start our Q&A. As we mentioned earlier, you can go ahead and post any questions in the YouTube live chat for this stream. The first question came in pretty early on in the presentation, and I know you covered some of this, but is there like a set of defined standards or checklists available for web designers to use to make sure they are accessible? Maybe just expand on that point a little bit around what standards exist.
Yeah, so there are standards around accessibility, which is WCAG, but those are more tailored towards kind of development and testing a site. So it's tricky to really get into like a design perspective because a design can only do so much in terms of accessibility. The main thing to keep in mind is color contrast, just general like readability. So like, is the text large enough and is the text written in clear to read language? And then also think about focus order. So anytime you have like lots of buttons and confusing order, that can be a big problem. So tending towards more simple layouts can help. Or if you do need a complex layout, remember to kind of map it out with your developers of like, okay, like the focus order should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So a screen reader user goes in some logical flow that makes sense. So unfortunately, not a specific guideline, but WCAG is the most helpful tool we have as far as I know.
Okay, so the next question. So for images such as infographics used, let's say, on a post or something like that in an app, what do you recommend someone do to make them more accessible? So would it be the alt tag tool, or would it be else for especially the non-developer crowd?
Great question. So if you're making like, it sounds like you're making content somewhere else. Like if you're posting it to like Facebook or Twitter, Twitter has an alt tag feature, as does I think Instagram and Facebook. And you can actually add alt tag of quite significant length there. And if it's an infographic, you actually want to make sure to describe what the graphic is conveying. So if, for example, it's like a bar chart showing like lead levels, then you want to actually get into like, in 2020, the lead level was this, in 2019, it was this, 2018, it was this. And that gets a bit lengthy, but usually those systems have a way of saying like the alt tag title and then the alt tag description. So you can say like infographic about lead from years 97 to 2020. And then in the description, you can go into the full details. So yes, graphs are actually a big problem because you want to make sure that you fully communicate the information via some alternative.
What about for systems that don't have like automatic alt tags? Is there a way to add that, or is that on the development side?
That's going to be on the development side typically. I don't know what this is specifically referring to, but most systems don't have something to add an automatic alt tag. You're going to want whoever's authoring that content to write it. Because like we mentioned, of it being context specific, it's really important that the person who's making the content, they're gonna have the best sense of what they're trying to convey.
Yeah, and I was like, it's my jobs app, so we're not very accessible right now. So that's why I was frantically taking notes of how great that is. Thank you.
So of course. The next question from the doc is, you had mentioned alt tags, and we just talked about it in more detail as well, and that they should be catered to an audience, catered to a context. Generally speaking, are there any best practices that you would impart for like civic tech or civic hacking in general with alt tag use and the context that might arise from that?
The main thing is just like, if civic tech, you're gonna have a lot of graphs and graphics and you wanna make sure that you convey that information. But the other thing, honestly, the biggest thing is people not adding alt tags, right? So the biggest thing you can do is learn about alt tags, look at some good examples, and just add alt tags, because even a mediocre alt tag is better than no alt tag, because if you have no alt tag, the user, like their screen reader might read out the file name, right? You might read out like whatever your file was, xyz.jpg. So adding an alt tag at all will help, but if it's anything conveying a specific information, you want to make sure that information is conveyed with that alt tag. And lastly, also you can use supplemental information, right? So if you have a graph and you want to have like a little description section that's collapsible, that has like the graph explained in a text form, that can be useful to people who aren't even using a screen reader. So you don't have to put it in the alt tag. It's just that information has to be somewhere outside of the image.
So let's see, the next question is, all right, well, I guess, I wonder at one point would it make sense to hire an accessibility consultant? So I guess maybe versus doing it like a DIY on yourself. You have any thoughts on that when it's needed?
Yeah, so it depends kind of like on your company and your organization size, but accessibility auditors who check your site for issues are really, really important and really helpful, because you're just not going to find most accessibility issues by yourself. it just takes a great deal of time and a lot of manual testing, because you have to remember screen readers, like browsers, are separate devices. So to get a good sense of if this works for everyone, you actually need to test in a variety of different screen readers on different operating systems. That can take a lot of time. But if you're just wondering about like my development process, if you have a big team of developers, you actually probably want to make sure they're trained on accessibility. So it might be worth hiring someone to teach them about it, but you want to make sure those skills are ingrained, because the biggest thing with accessibility, it's really hard to fix something after the fact. It's a lot easier to make it accessible from the get-go.
All right. Next up, do you know of any civic tech relevant groups or organizations that have robust accessibility processes or a consistent track record of good accessible design?
Ooh, that is a great question. And I wish I had a better answer to it. I don't really, I'm not super aware in either direction on that. I'm sure that the larger groups, what is the larger one? It's like the Brigade, Code for America. I'm sure Code for America, for example, I would expect an organization their size, they probably have a robust set of accessibility practices, because usually as a team grows and matures, you're going to be more aware of it. And you're going to start dedicating resources to it. So I'm sure they may actually have some guidelines out there for civic tech folks, but unfortunately, I'm not aware of any right now.
So is there any good advice for working with teams or clients who may not understand the importance of accessibility or who want to avoid the development time and cost?
Yeah, this is something I've been dealing with myself. It's a little bit tricky, but kind of the two approaches I take as a developer. First of all, kind of as part of my deal, I'm saying like, I make accessible products. That's part of what I do. I'm going to make it accessible. And that's kind of like your basis, right? Starting with that, because first of all, an accessible product is going to be easier to use for everyone. And that's not a selling point I like to hit on, because I don't think that's kind of like the right kind of starting tack. But if you're having a client who's like, yeah, well, I know my users, blah, blah, blah. You can tell them, okay, well, if I make this accessible, you're actually going to have an easier time using it, because there may be situations where you're going to need to take advantage of this. The other thing you can push on is the legal side, which again, I'm not as versed on. This is #not legal advice. But typically when you're a larger corporation, you need to have accessibility built in. Domino's recently got hit by this, because if you're a public accommodation, you need to be accessible to everyone, and especially during COVID, that includes your online presence. So you can tell them it's the right thing to do, it'll make the web better for everyone, and also you probably legally have to.
Next up, are there any special best practices that you know of for like GIS or for maps?
Ooh, that is a great question. I have no experience in kind of like the accessibility of maps and mapping tools, and I think that is probably I'll defer that to an expert, because I think that's probably quite complex. I'm sure tools like Google Maps have some accessibility things built in, but I'm not sure how they convey that totally. If you're doing like an actual like interactive map, that's where I'm not sure. If it's like a static map, alt tags are probably the way to go, but it's a great question. And I wish I had a better answer.
So are there any good contrast tools for images? So web AIM is helpful for font size, but not sure what to do about images and contrast. Any good tools?
So it depends on what you're asking. If you mean text in an image, the best tool, I think some design tools actually have it built in, but you can also just use the color picker to grab like the background of the like kind of color right behind the text, and then what the color is that you're applying, and make sure those are compliant. If you mean like an icon, again, color picker is your friend, right? Typically, if you're using an icon, it's going to be one color, and then you can just color pick it and say like, okay, is this, like in the icon example I give, is this help red contrast compliant on this white? But if it's text in images, extract those colors, put it into a contrast tool.
So the next one up is related to the question about mapping, but about a slightly different concept. Do you have any tips or guidance for data visualization or making data itself more accessible, like in a tool like Tableau, for instance?
Yeah, so the main thing to consider is just like, kind of make sure that all the interactive elements are accessible, make sure all of your buttons are clear. And something I did recently with a different project that was related to creating avatars is I actually had a button that was only screen reader accessible that read out the current settings. So for example, if you had something that dynamically showed a bar chart of 3 things, then maybe it would be helpful to like you can pick your categories, and then you have a button that says read out the results to me, that says like what are the results being shown in your visualization. The other thing here is that really, like, these are kind of my guidances as someone who would consider themselves like, I don't really have a disability. So the best thing to do is also to talk to people who have disabilities and see, hey, does this work for you? Like, I prototyped this thing where it reads out the infographic. Is that helpful to you? Because that's really going to be kind of your good guiding principles of, does it work for your users?
I think for the time being, that may have exhausted our Q&A. So I think, unless Ryan, you have access to secret questions I'm not aware of, it might be time to move on.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't want to hog up the conversation, so let's
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much. It's been great being here. And of course, if you have any other questions or you're seeing this in the far future, 2021, 2022, my contact information is up there. So feel free to reach out, distant future friends.
All right. Thank you, Victor, for presenting. We're going to head now into the next portion of the night. And for those of you who want to potentially join us in the next portion of the night, you can get into the next Zoom call where we announce our breakout groups and people get together and work on stuff together by going to bit.ly/chn-remote-zoom. That link will be posted in the ChiHackNight Slack in the ChiHackNight-remote channel momentarily. And if you're not part of the ChiHackNight Slack yet and anything about this event interests you, feel free to go to slackme.chihacknight.org, and that'll send you a join link to join us in the Slack. Tonight's broadcast will be posted in the coming days on our YouTube channel, so you can review it there.
Yeah, I think you covered most of it. I think we'll also before the breakout groups, we will have a little bit of time to kind of get to know each other and chat a little bit. So even if you don't do a breakout group, just come and say hi. So join the post live stream Zoom.
Yeah, for sure. So until then, stay safe, take care,
Go forward,
and hack.
there we go. All right. Good night, everyone.